The debut novel, Green on Blue by Elliot Ackerman, a decorated soldier in the Iraq-Afghan War, provides insights into the young hearts and minds of Afghan soldiers in the tribal areas of Afghanistan. Elliot joins us now to discuss his amazing book. Hi, Elliot.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Elliot, first tell us about your role during the multiple tours that you've had.
I served as a Marine Corps infantry officer and then later a special operations officer, as well as doing some work in the intelligence community. And later on, when I got into special operations, I worked as an advisor in Afghanistan to various Afghan army and militia units.
Wow. Well, now, Green on Blue is told through the eyes of a young Afghan orphan turned soldier. Aziz is his name, and he works for the U.S.-funded militia. When we first meet Aziz, what makes him motivated to join the war effort?
Well, as you mentioned, the story is all told in the first person, and the narrator is Aziz. The opening line of the book is, "Many people would call me a dishonest man, but I've always kept faith with myself." There's an honesty in that, I think. And so the conceit of the book is very much to tell Aziz's story. And so as you meet him, he's growing up in a remote village in Afghanistan, and both of his parents are killed. And this is the period after the Russian war, but before the American invasion. And then his older brother takes him to a market where they try to eke out a living working as basically delivery boys. And then there's a bombing in that market, and his brother is horribly wounded and finds himself in the hospital. And as Aziz is sort of wandering the corridors of these hospitals, trying to figure out how he's going to take care of his brother, he gets recruited into the Special Lashkar, a U.S.-funded militia. And the deal is basically that his wages as a soldier will be used to keep his brother in the hospital. And under those conditions, he goes off to fight.
What motivated you to write the book, and also why did you choose the fictional format?
Well, as I mentioned before, I served as an advisor to Afghan soldiers. So when I came back, I felt a visceral need to tell Aziz's story. And it's a story of imagination. I mean, it's not my experience. But when I came back, my war buddies who I'd fought alongside as an advisor, they weren't guys that I could go down to the local VFW with and get quarter beers or keep up with on Facebook or call long distance. They were Afghan soldiers, and trapped as they were in Afghanistan's elliptical conflict, upon coming back to the States, I knew I would never see any of them again. So I wrote this book in an attempt to render their world, in my mind, as really a last act of friendship.
Tell us about some of the characters, Commander Sabir and Ghazan and Mr. Jack. What roles do they play? Sure.
Well, Commander Sabir leads the Special Lashkar, which is the militia unit that Aziz goes off to fight with. And as you meet him, he's someone who's obviously very prominent. He is running this group of Afghans that secure a pretty wide swath of the border. But as Aziz starts to work for Commander Sabir, he starts to see the many, many layers of his motivations and the way that he's involved in the war. And he comes to realize that Commander Sabir's role in the war is really much more complex than it seems in face value. And another one of the characters, Ghazan, is basically a somewhat, at least at the beginning of the novel, shadowy Taliban figure who is, at face value, Commander Sabir's antagonist and the person that they're fighting along the border. So all these characters, as Aziz sees it, they're all wrapped up in this cycle of warfare and revenge. And as Aziz gets more and more involved in it, he starts to see the true nature of the war that he's come to fight.
Explain the word Badal and Nang.
Well, central to Aziz's war, and central to that region, which is a Pashto region, is this code called Pashtunwali. And Pashtunwali, directly translated, means the way of the Pashtuns. And it's something that's very, very important there, and it has several tenets. One of the tenets, as you mentioned, is Badal, which is this idea of revenge. There's the idea of Nang, which stands for its personal honor. Malmakdia, which is hospitality towards others who might come to you for sanctuary. So these ideas in Pashto culture, as I experience them, I mean, they're more important than even Islam. In fact, the Pashtuns have a saying that we've been Muslim for 600 years, but we've been Pashtun forever, because Islam only came to that part of the world in the 1400s. So, so this is a driving force throughout Aziz's experience in the book.
How do honor and revenge impact ordinary people in Afghanistan?
Well, you know, these ideas of honor and revenge become cyclical. So, a wrong is done towards one person, and they feel, based off of honor, the need to perpetuate that wrong. And if we look at the conditions in Afghanistan, these wars have been going on for more than 30 years. And it's not the only driving factor. I mean, there's significant political events as well, but it's a strong strain within it. But I think that transcends just issues in Afghanistan. And even here in the U.S., we have ideas of honor and revenge. They're just much more formally codified in that society under these tenets of Pashtunwali. So in the novel, too, I get into these issues, but I think it's something that we can reflect on, that it applies to us as well.
Is it possible to be both brutal and empathetic at the same time?
It's possible to be brutal and empathetic. I think it is. I mean, I think that people, the brutality, and what I hope in the book that the reader conveys from it is that by the time you get to the end of the book, where you're seeing what is basically a lot of brutality, and you see this green on blue attack, that you've peeled back the layers enough, and you understand why that decision is made. And that the reader will have some empathy. They might not agree with why it's made, but they'll at least see the rationale behind it. So I think that brutality, empathy, compassion, I mean, those are emotions that reside within each of us. So if each of us have the capacity for brutality and for empathy and compassion, I think it's most certainly possible to be both at once.
Okay. I think it's Commander Sabir that tells Aziz that if you supply your opponent, then you really own that opponent and the war. Does that mean that the Lashkar are arming the very enemy that they're trying to fight?
Well, in the novel, you see that they are. So in the novel, Commander Sabir, as you learn, he is helping perpetuate the war. But one of the things Aziz asks him, he says, well, what type of, Sabir last time says, you don't really know what type of war this is. And the idea that I'm getting at there is that there are economies that build up around war. And I don't mean necessarily just financial economies. There are economies in that people hold positions and status because of the war, and they get invested in those positions. And so it's oftentimes it's very easy to become involved in a war that's getting fought for every reason but the ending of that war.
The corrupt village elder Atal tells the confident American Mr. Jack that some wars are only fed upon themselves and can't be won. And Mr. Jack says, well, every war can be won, but not every war is well fought. Do you think this war is ill fought?
I think what I think doesn't really matter. When I'm writing, I'm not trying to tell anybody anything. I'm trying to show something. And in Green on Blue, I'm trying to show a dynamic in the Afghan war that I saw play out time and time again. And I'm trying to give voice to different opinions that I had seen. So in that case, when Atal is saying this war cannot be won, only starved, what he's getting at is that the objectives from the war have become murky, that these economies I mentioned before of war are real, and they will keep perpetuating unless they are starved. And Mr. Jack is, I think, echoing a much more American perspective on war that we probably hold more intuitively, which is that wars are fought for causes, they have a specific beginning, and they have a specific end. And what I wanted to set up in that in particular is the difference between those two ideas and hold them in contrast to one another.
And so, in fact, Mumtaz, the old man, tells Aziz that wars were once fought for people's future, and now they're fought for advantage and profit. So do you think that's true?
I think Mumtaz thinks it's true. Again, I am trying to lend voice to many different perspectives that I had seen, and I think the reader should decide whether or not they think that's true. But Mumtaz's character is an old Mujahideen fighter who'd fought the Russians in the early days of Afghanistan's war in the 1980s. And what he's reflecting upon is that when he was a young Mujahideen, they were fighting for this idea of what Afghanistan could be, and that they were sacrificing their futures for a larger one. And then Mumtaz's estimation, that has dissipated, and now the war's not being fought for any idea of a future. It's just being fought because it's continuing to perpetuate upon itself. And so this conception that he has is one that he voices to Aziz as he sees Aziz getting pulled deeper and deeper into this elliptical conflict.
What led you into military life and then into writing?
Well, I joined the Marines right out of college. I was an officer, and I wanted a job where whether or not I was good at my job or bad at my job really mattered. And it did. It mattered in terms of life. I had a lot of responsibility very young. I was 23 years old and in charge of 45 Marines. And I came in the Marines at what would be a very interesting time. I was commissioned in 2003, the same year we invaded Iraq. So that was my impetus for joining the service. And I didn't know if I thought I would stay as long as I did. I did 8 years. But these wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, have gone on for a long time, and they haven't had a real ending. And so those who've become involved in them, who are all volunteers, for the most part, we've all had to make a separate peace and decide when the war was over for us. We were never told that it was over. So after 8 years, I decided to go my last deployment, and I'd always thought that I wanted to write. My mother is a novelist, so I grew up around books and with the idea of writing. And I studied history and literature at university. And once I was done the service, I decided that was the direction I wanted to go. Started writing.
Well, many leading authors are praising this book. Khalid Hosseini, the Kite Runner, author of The Kite Runner, and also one of your fellow authors compares Green on Blue to Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Have these comparisons surprised you?
I think they're very generous comparisons, and I'm grateful that the book resonated with those authors, and I'm appreciative of them. But again, I set out to write a book that showed a dynamic that I saw play out time and time again in Afghanistan, and in an effort to try to render the world and lend voice to the Afghans who I was an advisor to. And if the book does those two things, I feel like it succeeds.
What's been the biggest challenge in writing the novel for you?
How much time do we have for this interview?
And how many revisions did you go through?
Yeah, I mean, any novel is sort of a process of self-discovery. You don't always know where the book is going. I think you have to have an open spirit to let it take you places. For me, one of the things that was the most challenging was, the book is all told in the first person in Aziz's voice, but actually it didn't start out with that construct. The original construct of the book was each chapter began with Aziz telling his story to an American, almost in this cadence, like a kind of Conradian cadence in The Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe is telling his story about going up the river to see Kurtz on a boat in the Thames, and that was sort of the initial frame. And after writing for a while, I had to ask myself, why did I put this American character? Why is Aziz telling his story to an American? Why did I put this frame in place? And why am I sticking this American between Aziz and the reader as an intermediary? And after going through rounds of revisions and asking myself that question, I realized that I'd created this American as a crutch, that it was a filter to allow me to inhabit Aziz's voice. Said, well, if he's telling it to an American, he's telling it to me, and I guess I, the author of this American, is receiving the story. And I realized that if my goal for the novel was to let the reader understand Aziz's point of view, the more honest thing was to remove this American character and allow Aziz to speak directly to the reader. But that was a challenge, and it was something that I certainly wrestled with, because I knew at that point there would be no going back, and the book would completely or totally fail or succeed based off of the strength of Aziz's voice.
Well, what important ideas and actions would you like for the Americans to take away with them when they read the book?
I hope that an American reader will be able to understand in greater depth that there is a moral relativity that exists in war, and that people are making decisions, like for instance this Green on Blue attack, which at face value is one of the most reprehensible things you can do. An Afghan soldier betrays his American advisor and kills him. But I wanted to peel that back and show the layers of motivation that exist behind a decision such as that. And that doesn't necessarily mean the reader is supposed to agree with it when it happens, but I wanted them to see the complexity in these people's lives. And if they do that, I feel the book has been a success.
You now live in Istanbul, where you write on the Syrian civil war. Will that be a topic for the next book?
Funny you should ask. My next novel is set on the Turkish-Syrian border, and that's a love story.
A love story?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, okay. And Elliot, we thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Doris.
Elliot Ackerman, author of Green on Blue, just out from Scribner, Simon & Schuster.